Inflammation is not the cause, it's the effect. The cause is upstream of that. It's the disturbed immune system. And that disturbed immune system can come as a consequence of...
What are some of the top foods to eat to lose weight and fight disease?
Okay, so these have historically been called like superfoods. So I just want to put on the airways here that superfoods can be considered kind of a misnomer, because many of these things that we consider as products that we eat that have certain nutritional values that might relate to health, you couldn't live on them as your sole source of nutrition. Like blueberries, you can't live forever on blueberries. You can't live forever on cruciferous vegetables. So I think these become kind of condiments that deliver certain nutritional characteristics that are associated with health. But if we really want to talk about foods that relate to health, then we have to ask, historically, going back maybe thousands of years, are the things that we can learn from cultures about the foods that they've eaten that supply major parts of their calorie intake that are associated with long life, health, ability to overcome disease, work hard under extreme conditions, without medicines, without pharmacotherapy. And there is where the lessons really become interesting, because now we get a legacy that's the most important teacher of all, which is history. And there are foods that have survived throughout those generations to teach us things, both from, say, Ayurvedic medicine, from traditional Chinese medicine, from Native American medicine, cultures that have thousands of years of history that can teach us a little bit about those foods that really deliver significant value in terms of health promotion, disease prevention.
Fascinating. So what are some of those teachings and foods?
Okay, so let's start with cultured products. It's very interesting if you study fermentation processes and go back in the history of foods, you'll find that because we didn't have refrigeration, most cultures then found ways of preserving things by either salting them, drying them, or fermenting them. And fermented foods have been historically used throughout virtually every culture as providing unique benefits. So you can ferment vegetables, you can ferment grains, and you can ferment dairy products, as we know. You can ferment fruits. And all of those different products have different unique characteristics that are different than eating the food in this natural, unprocessed state. So I think fermented foods, it's a relationship to the microbiome and how that controls our immune health, becomes one of the major interesting patterns that we can historically look at to say, ooh, there's something there that we should be more attentive to today. So that'd be my number one. Number two, if you look at foods that contain protein, carbohydrate, fat, vitamins, minerals, fiber, accessory nutrients, and phytochemicals, how many foods then can provide significant amounts of calories that deliver all those in one package? And there are a few foods that fulfill that criteria. These are not hybridized. These are not genetically modified. These are natural foods. One that we've been very interested in happens to come back from a 2,500-year history called Himalayan tartary buckwheat. A very lengthy name, but a very unique 2,500-year-old food that delivers all those values that I just mentioned.
A breed of buckwheat.
A genetic strain of buckwheat that's uniquely different than common buckwheat, which is called esculatum. This is the Tataricum version, and it contains a powerhouse of immune active nutrients 50 to 100 times higher than any other known food.
Wow. And how did you discover this?
Well, I didn't discover it. I just happened to, this, like you, we meet these most interesting people, this serendipity of our lives. What I'm coming to recognize as I get older now, the concept of coincidence is probably not coincidence. We hang out with certain people, we're more likely than to have certain experiences. So it turned out that there were three experiences I had that all triangulated together within a couple of months. Number one is I was engaged in a collaborative research project with a professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University, and he was looking at a very interesting substance that was improving blood pressure through the immune system. And the source of that turned out to be Himalayan tartary buckwheat. So that was the first time I ever heard about it. And the name of this substance is called 2-hydroxylbenzylamine, or 2-HOBA.
Gesundheit.
Yes, exactly. So I got very interested in, okay, what's this? I never heard about that before. Then within that same week, I came back and spoke with my colleague who has been working with me now for over 25 years, Trish Shiri, and he said, Trish, you ever heard of this Himalayan tartary buckwheat? And she said, no, I let me look it up on the web. And she said, hey, I found only one person that seems to grow it in the United States. He's in upstate New York. He was a former Cornell agriculture research professor. He's now retired. His name is Sam Beer. Maybe you want to call him and talk to him. So I did. That started that conversation. It turns out that he and his wife had a hobby farm, only people growing it in the United States that I could find. And then the next thing that happened the following week, I took off. I was invited to speak to about 10,000 docs in China at Harbin at the annual Health Check Center meeting in China. And my guide there was a Shanghaiese doctor, but his PhD was from the United States. And we got talking. We spent a week together. And on the bullet train coming back from Harbin, which is the northernmost big city, about 20 million people up northern China, all the way to Shanghai, 2,600 miles on the bullet train at 300 miles an hour, I might say, quiet and vibration free.
That's cool.
And we watching China pass by us like a diorama.
Wow.
Halfway across China, I turned to him, I said, so I know this is a wild card, but have you ever heard of Himalayan tartary buckwheat? Well, it was like we froze time. It's like the train stopped. And he looked at me and he goes, you got to be kidding me. I said, no, why? He says, my group, my research and clinical group is the largest group in Asia doing research on Himalayan tartary buckwheat. And we've been looking for someone in the United States that has an interest, that has your background, that we could collaborate on research. So now I have my Vanderbilt University, I've got my farmer in upstate New York, and I've got my connection with China with the growing of this Himalayan tartary buckwheat, and away we go.
So this isn't the kind of buckwheat that like you make pancakes with, I'm assuming.
You can.
You can.
Yes. We have recipes now. We're the only, now I'm in organic farming. I own parts of organic farms. I own part of an artisanal miller in Trumansburg, New York, and I'm in Angelica, New York with these farms. We have a master farmer that is got a cooperative on Himalayan tartary buckwheat, and we're the first organic certified Himalayan tartary buckwheat produced in the United States.
So what's so special about it? It meets your criteria for being, is it nutrient density ultimately that we're talking about?
High in protein, 12%, very high for a vegetable protein product, no gluten, high in essential amino acids, so you could live on this protein, high in prebiotic fibers, very high in vitamins, high in minerals, zinc and magnesium particularly, high in omega-3 fats, and has 50 to 100 times the level of immune active phytonutrients than normal buckwheat.
Now, are these like nutrients bioavailable? Because I know it's one of the concerns that people often will raise when it comes to plant-based sources of minerals and the like.
That's a really great question. So the answer is yes. We have just finished a clinical trial, clinicaltrials.gov. You can look us up. Our research is now being analyzed, 50 people on 3 months of supplementation, looking at the effect on their immune systems through epigenetic markers. And the answer is yes. We see direct evidence that it's absorbed and has influence on cell signaling and the immune system, and relates to improved immune rejuvenation and what we call immune resilience.
That's amazing. So you guys are now obviously bringing this to market. Is it available at this point?
Yes. Yeah. We have a miller, and we have it available. We have a food lab that's developing recipes and menu guides. We have chefs that are now using it, talking about its application in their various products from savory to sweets. And we're off trying to reintroduce Himalayan tartary buckwheat, which, by the way, was a colonial food in America. It was brought over by our colonial ancestors because it's so hardy. It doesn't require fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. It doesn't require any kind of, even like poor quality soils. It has an aluminum detoxifying mechanism in its root nodules. So it's a very, very hardy product that was lost about 200 years ago in America.
That's awesome. Wow, so cool. And it's one of these foods that like people have been, as you mentioned, eating for millennia.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, if you look in the Himalayas, how it was traditionally used, it was made into this kind of a waffle cone that the individuals, when they went out hunting, would take with them because it was very impervious to any kind of aging, and they could eat this as their sole source of nutrition over weeks of being out in the field.
So it's like one of these like robust plants.
Yes.
Which exactly. I think is cool because the plants that tend to possess that degree of vigor, they seem to show an ability of passing that vigor onto whoever eats it, right? Like,
oh boy, you're on track. I so appreciate that, because people don't understand it, but plants have immune systems. And their systems obviously are not exactly the same as humans. They don't have white blood cells floating around in the plant stems, but they have a comparable immune system to the innate and the adaptive immune system in humans. It turns out that their immune system is activated and modulated in part by the phytochemicals they produce that are in response to the environment in which they're grown. So when you have plants that are grown in hostile environments like in Siberia or the Himalayas, where they've had to survive millennia by natural selection against the hazards of nature, they have evolved this extraordinary protective ability in their immune system to defend themselves against all sorts of hazards. And when we eat those foods, as you just indicated, that translates that information from the signal of a plant's immune system to our immune system. It's a very powerful example of coevolution and how we actually connect ourselves into planets. And then, by the way, if we want to go one step farther and say the soil in which that plant grew, what about the mycorrhiza of the soil? Is there any relationship between the immune defense of the soil mycorrhiza to the immune defense of the plant to the immune defense of the human eating it? And the answer is yes. And in fact, we have just finished a field trial in our upstate New York organic plots in which we inoculated the seeds with various mycorrhiza of different types to see if we could enhance the phytochemical level in the final plant product, the Himalayan tartary buckwheat seed. And the answer is yes. We've now just finished that 1-year study showing that if you actually nourish the soil with the right nutrients, the right mycorrhiza, you then get the plants producing higher levels of phytochemicals for which this humans eating it get the initial benefit of those immune strengthening nutrients.
What is that? What is the term mycorrhiza?
Mycorrhiza, it has to do with the complex nature of the bacteria, the fungi, all the things that live in our soil that give plants their ability to do their thing.
And that, I mean, the mycorrhiza is under attack these days.
Is it ever? Is it ever? We've depleted the mycorrhiza. We've kind of deconditioned the soil. We're sterilizing our soils. And as a consequence, it has an adverse effect on, things that come from plants who need those things for being truly healthy.
You often hear that food is less nutritious. It's trending towards being less nutrient dense, right? Is there any truth to that?
I think it depends a little bit on what you want to look at as it relates to the nutrient. And, is it a vitamin? Is it a mineral? Is it a protein? And the answer overall probably is we couldn't say there's gross neglect of the nutrition quality. But if we look at certain secondary conditions of the plant, like these phytochemicals, then we really do start seeing very significant differences. It's probably the major difference between an organically produced product and an agribusiness produced product are these secondary nutrients.
Yeah, like the plant defense compounds.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Well, so this Himalayan tartary buckwheat sounds super cool. I can't wait to learn more and to possibly try it. I know a person now, so hopefully I'll be able to get some. But what are some other foods that you think are fairly accessible that can help, in the fight for better waistline, increased resilience to disease? So let's talk a little bit about the concept of our waistline. And so I'm going to take maybe a little bit of a contrarian position because the calories still seem to be a primacy of our concern about how we are an obese society because of excess calorie consumption. And I don't want to throw the first law of thermodynamics out and say there's no such thing as the calorie contributing to obesity. It certainly does contribute, but it's not the whole story. A human being is not a calorimeter. We don't burn our logs of food in a fireplace like you do in a calorimeter to produce the number of calories of heat energy. What we do is we metabolize them under a very detailed and controlled process that has many different touch points in our control by many genes that regulate how selectively those foods get decompartmentalized into energy. Now, with that in mind, let's look at obesity for a second. If we look at obesity, there's really two types of obesity. There's what I call those that have friendly fat and those that have angry fat. Now, friendly fat are like in this holiday season, like ho, ho, ho with Santa Claus. And there are people that have absolute health in morbid obesity. Now, how does that happen if fat causes all these illnesses? It's because their fat is happy. Now, what does happy fat mean? Well, let's do the converse. Angry fat. Angry fat is where your fat mass has been infiltrated by angry white blood cells, your immune system, because they are at unrest. And they communicate then with the cells that make up your fat mass that are called adipocytes. And that crosstalk between an angry macrophage from your immune system and a fat cell produces an angry fat cell. And what it does then is it alters its gene expression patterns and produces a whole series of inflammatory mediators that go out into the bloodstream and affect tissues all over your body. It makes your whole body inflamed as a consequence. Now you get type 2 diabetes, you get arthritis, you get neurological dysfunction, you get increased risk to cancer, you get heart disease. All these things are a secondary byproduct from angry fat. So now you're going to say, well, where does angry fat come from? It comes from
an active immune system that's feeling like it's doing battle with the outside world. And where does that come from? That comes from the exposure to things that activate your immune system to think that's under siege. And when we say that, then we move upstream. We say, well, what about the microbiome? Maybe you have angry microbiome because you're exposing your microbiome to bad foods, foods that are toxic, nutrient depleted, highly overprocessed foods, a lot of sugar that causes hyperglycemia, indications of heat damaged foods, oxidized foods, rancid foods, all of which activate your gut microbiome to produce a series of messenger compounds at your immune system, of which 60% of your immune system is clustered around your intestinal tract, to think that they're picking up a relay race of bad information to take that into your blood, speaking to your fat cells to say, guys, you should be fed up with what's going on and you should fight back. And so your body fat then says, okay, you're right. I'm fed up with this. I'm going to release a bunch of messenger compounds to the brain and the heart and the pancreas saying, stop doing this to me. So that's, to me, when we talk about obesity as a health-related issue, we want to go upstream and we want to ask, where does the source of the problem occur, not just downstream on what happens on the scale.
That's fascinating because so many people think of their fat tissue as an inert storage site for excess calories, but you're saying that it's not inert at all, that it secretes hormones, that it's a metabolically active organ, and that it's responsive to our immune systems.
That's beautifully stated, and that's the learnings, I think, within our field over the last say 20 years. That what we thought of as white fat just kind of sitting there as a depot storage for extra calories, as triglycerides for a rainy day that never comes, we now recognize actually is very participatory in the overall endocrine or functional hormone balance of our body that signals to all other tissues, not just solely. That's why we say obesity is associated with dementia, why obesity is associated with heart disease, obesity is associated with diabetes. It has to signal to those other organs that there's something not at rest, that we're into a state of inflammation.
So what is the significance, Dr. Bland? Because you mentioned 60% of our immune system is located in and around our gut.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that? I mean, that's a fascinating figure.
Well, let's look at that for a second. If you were a designer of the human model, and you said there was going to be an immune system, where would you stuff it, right? Where would you put it if you were designing the body? And you might say, well, are you asking me a cosmetic question? Like I want to put somewhere that's out of reach? Or are you talking a functional question? I want to put it somewhere where it was really doing its work most effectively. Well, it turns out that the immune system, the reason it's clustered, I believe, around the intestinal tract is because over the course of living, an average person will consume somewhere between 10 and 20 tons of food. And 10 and 20 tons of food is made up of substances that are not the same as your body substances. So there has to be a translation of the message somehow between what you eat, which is a foreigner, and how it gets to your body that has to be a friend. Part of that is the digestive process, but also part of that is diffusing that message by your immune system, which happens to be clustered around the intestinal tract to do that translation. So we have all this innate immune system activity sitting there with their antennae up, waiting to see if a friend or a foe is going to arrive. And if it's a foe, it's going to signal to the rest of the body, get ready, we got a battle going on. And that then signals to all the other tissues downstream what's going on.
Wow. Yeah, because I guess I would think that like your immune system would be most primed to pay attention to what's going on around your skin, but your skin is like, I guess, pretty it's not really all that porous. I mean, it's like porous to some degree, but it's like really like your throat is where you start to like, where foreign invaders can potentially gain access to what's in your body, and then going down the intestinal tract. It's a much larger interface.
So what you're talking about, and you're right on track here, those are the mucosal barriers of your body, the mucosal barriers. So it starts in the tongue, the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, down into your stomach, into your duodenum, down in your large, ileum and jejunum of your small intestine, and finally your colon. That whole plumbing is lined by a very thin lining called your mucosal cells, which are the cells that are responsible for translating the message that they're being exposed to from whatever goes down that tract, that piece of plumbing, to the rest of the body. And there's actually a set of cells that are called the enteroendocrine cells, which are actually stimulated by various food principles to release various hormones into your blood that do things like stimulate insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammation. But if you send the wrong message, then you send messages of alarm to those cells in your ileum, in your small intestine, and they release inflammatory molecules that then produce a state of alarm. So this constant communication between the inside and outside world, there are actually only three tissues or three cell types in the body. They're 24/7, 365 communicating with the outside world. What are they? Well, I've talked about the mucosal surfaces. By the way, they're also on your whole airways as well. Your nose, your whole breathing apparatus to your lungs are lined by the same type of cells. And that's why if you look at SARS-CoV-2, where did you see the infection? Both respiratory epithelium and gastrointestinal epithelium, because they share similar things with the ACE2 receptors and the SARS-CoV-2 virus. All of those are interrelated to the infection with what became COVID-19. So the mucosal surfaces are one. Second is your nervous system communicating through all the senses, 365, and your immune system. Now, of those, the one that can change most rapidly actually is your immune system. You turn over your immune cells about every, depending upon the type of cell, but let's say on average of days to weeks. So over a course of a couple of months, the cells that make up your immune system right now will be replaced by new cells. And then the question is, are they as good as, better than, or the same as the ones they're replacing? And that process of immune turnover relates to then your immune defense. And if your immune system is picking up information from the way you're living and the environment you're exposed to, it's going to then change its personality to try to defend you against what it perceives to be a hostile invader. And that will then create problems like inflammation that translates to arthritis, and it translates to all these things that we see as autoimmune disease, which is a rising spectrum of concerns today in our population.
Wow. So our immune system actually is quite dynamic, and we have the ability then to influence its makeup.
Absolutely. And that's the powerful thing that we've been focusing on. We call it immunorejuvenation. We know what happens when the immune system is injured. It goes into a state of inflammation. The question is it a one-way street? And the results from research in the immune system over the last decade, particularly fueled by things like SARS that got people interested even more in immune activity, we've learned it's a two-way street. Things that go one way can be reversed the other way. The reversal occurs through processes like autophagy and mitophagy that selectively then allow you to renew an immune system. And the foods that we're talking about earlier happen to be the foods that have nutrients that are supportive of doing that.
Interesting. So foods like fermented foods.
Yes.
Foods like these like plant defense compounds.
Yeah, we think of berries, right? High in ellagic acid, for instance. Ellagic acid is one of those substances that goes into the gut. It is programmed to influence favorably your microbiome, which then gets absorbed through the immune system of your intestinal tract to signal to your body, hey, we're friendly now. We don't need to be so much in alarm. And that then calms down inflammation, calms down immune. Inflammation, by the way, is an outcome. It's not the cause of disease. It's the effect of an upstream process of immune imbalance.
So is the carnivore diet then just like the worst idea from the vantage point of immune rejuvenation?
I don't think it's the worst idea. I think that we have to, again, put these things kind of in context, that if you look at animal products that we would consume in our diet that have been naturally raised and are not subjected to all sorts of chemical exposures, they have very, very good balance of protein and, generally omega-3 fats if they're naturally wild. And they're rich in minerals and vitamins. So you might say, hey, that sounds pretty good. What they're devoid of at any measurable level are these phytochemicals, because those are plant derived. So that's why I tend to think of the Pegan diet. It kind of, as Mark Hyman talked about in one of his most recent books, Dr. Hyman, about kind of putting together organic, natural animal products with complex, multicolored vegetable products to form the best harmony orchestration you can think to support an immune system.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. And I also think that like person to person, there's going to be differences in terms of tolerance to various plants, vegetables and the like. And so you have to ultimately see what works best for you. But, the sort of overarching guidance is to incorporate a balance of both animal products and wild plants.
I absolutely agree. We call it kind of a modified Mediterranean style of eating. And that's part of our whole, I put this company together, Big Bold Health, really to focus on this whole concept of immune rejuvenation. How do we really implement this, moving from an academic kind of immune research to where we can deliver this to people that really can put it in their lives? And when you start thinking about the ways that we could implement immunorejuvenation, kind of reframing our immune system, retraining it to be more of our friend so that we own our immune system rather than it owning us. Part of that has to do with this dietary intake, because one shared common experience I've learned in my life, all people seem to share, is we eat something. And the food is information. Food is not just calories, vitamins, and minerals. Food is information that then patterns how our genes are expressed. And so what you want to do is eat food that's compatible with genes that tell you you're having a good day, not that you're in doing battle with your environment.
I love that. Food is information. What are some of the so-called bad foods, or the foods worth avoiding or at least minimizing with regard to their impact on the microbiome and subsequently these inflammatory processes that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think we can start at the head of the list. The head of the class of baddies are those that increase and the fugitive molecule glucose having a run of the mill in your house, which is your body, and creating havoc. Glucose is a sugar. So any food that causes your body to have excess glucose going around and interacting in ways that's mischievous. So these would highly processed, sugar-free, nutrient-depleted, white sugar, white flour, white sugar, fat, and salt type of diets, right?
Yeah.
And so I ask a question. This is kind of an interesting little sidebar. So what happens if you have excess sugar floating around in your body? So, well, isn't that diabetes? Well, not necessarily. There are cases where you can have increased sugar floating around your body without diabetes, just because you've not controlled it and regulated it in an effective way. We learned that through a new kind of trend, as you probably have talked about, this continuous glucose monitoring technology, where you put this thing on your body and you can measure your blood sugar continuously throughout the day. We've done all sorts of studies with these CGM monitors over the last few years. And it's really fascinating because people that are not diabetic, because of the way they're eating, may have times during the day that their blood sugar looks like they're at the top of the Andes Mountains. It's so high. But then it plummets down and goes low and produces hypoglycemia. So the average looks like it's not diabetic. They're just going up and down from a desert to a mountain with their blood sugar. In the cases where your blood sugar is spiking high, what does that do? Your body needs to find a place to put that sugar. And what it does is it chemically reacts with proteins. This is a process called glycosylation. Now, those who have watched any advertisements on the electronic media, you hear about A1C. What is A1C? A1C is a substance that's produced in our body when sugar reacts with a protein in our blood called hemoglobin. Our blood cells are about 70% occupied by hemoglobin. And when you have high sugar and it is then trying to find a place to stick, not necessarily where you want it to go, but where it will chemically react, it often reacts with proteins like hemoglobin. So we say excess A1C is a sign of bad sugar management, like diabetes. Now, what happens is when you're forming glycohemoglobin, is your sugar is also reacting with other proteins. It's not just hemoglobin, any protein that's available, particularly proteins floating around in your blood. So what's the principal blood protein? It's not hemoglobin, it's albumin. Albumin is what carries protein from your blood to all your tissues. It will nourish the tissues with protein, then deliver amino acids. So if your sugar is high, it's reacting with your albumin in your blood. That forms glycoalbumin. Now, let me talk just briefly about this. Sounds rather nerdy, but I'll bring this down hopefully to understandable.
We like it.
And so this sugar, when it reacts with proteins like albumin, will form what is called an advanced glycosylation end product. Now, what is the acronym that comes from that term, advanced glycosylation end product? A, advanced, G, glycosylation, E, end product, AGE. Your body is aging. Now, where does that aged protein then have its effect? It turns out that you have receptors sitting on cells of your body like antennae that pick up the message of these agents, these advanced glycosylation end product proteins. So they are called receptors of advanced glycosylation end products. What's the acronym? R for receptor, A, age, glycosylation G, end products E, RAGE.
Rage.
So you're enraged when you're in a state of aging due to glycosylation
Wow.
because you ate a sugar-rich diet that is every day stealing from you your functional capability.
That's crazy. So is it to avoid all foods with glucose or starch, or is there where do you draw the line, right? Because whole fruit obviously is going to contain a blend of fructose and glucose, right? Like the occasional white rice that I have with my sushi, is that driving aging when I eat it, or is it a certain source of carbohydrates that we want to be particularly mindful of?
Well, now we're really having fun. So absolutely, that question is right at the head of trying to figure out what to eat to actually promote proper function. So we now know, and I think people who have ever had a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, put on their body knows that their relationship with their food is very unique to them. So I've known this in my own family. We've all had CGMs on. We're all familiar, related, but we can eat the same food at the same meal, and we can have different blood sugar responses to that food. And so you start saying, hold it, are there certain kind of principles that we would say are good for everybody? And yes, like minimally processed whole foods generally have lowered glucose response. Highly processed foods generally have higher glucose responses. But each person eating a highly processed food doesn't have the exact same response. Like there's some people that can have a candy bar and it doesn't really spike their blood sugar very much. Another person eating that same candy bar, it may just put their blood sugar into the Andes or the Himalayan mountains. It's so high. Now, it's very interesting for me, just to do a little simple mind math with you. Let's take a candy bar as an example in terms of glucose. So a candy bar, let's say one serving, may deliver something on the order of 30 grams of, that would be an ounce approximately, of sugar. And so if an ounce of sugar, what does that mean, 30 grams? Well, let's say that all went into your blood because it's rapidly absorbed from a candy bar into your blood within a very short period of time. Just for the sake of speculation, let's say it went in your blood within 20 to 30 minutes. Now, that means all of that sugar, all those molecules of glucose would end up in your sugar, that's 30 grams. Then it begs the question, what's the total amount of sugar in your whole bloodstream?
Probably pretty low.
Yeah, so you have about 100 milligrams per 100 milliliters. So that would be 1,000 milligrams per liter, and you've got 5 liters. So you got about 5 grams of sugar in your total body bloodstream. Now you just eat 30 grams.
Wow.
Can you see what has to happen? That's like a fire drill. Your body has to find a place to put all that extra sugar. It's like, oh my word, I send out the guard. Tell the pancreas to secrete a lot of insulin. We got to find places to put this because this is way more than we can tolerate, or we're going to have all sorts of mischief going on.
And is there really that like urgency in the body? Because under physiologic conditions, you've got 5 grams of sugar, right? Suddenly it's 35 grams, right?
Yeah.
So it's like 6 times as much, right? The body I guess the body must know that sugar is intrinsically damaging when it's elevated to that degree. Does it not?
And that's why the body will send out all the guards to protect us from that decision. And some people who have a lot of really great resilience and reserve, their beta cells of their pancreas that secrete insulin are in really good shape. Their glucagon stimulating, producing cells are great. Their cortisol is great. Everything is working in harmony, growth hormone, all these IGF-1, all these things are in great orchestration. So you have a candy bar and it doesn't really affect your blood sugar that much and you're great. But what happens if you continue to put the pedal to the metal? What happens if you have genetic uniqueness? What happens if you've been on depleted diets? What happens, I can go down the list.
Yeah.
Now suddenly that becomes problematic.
So the acute spike is not a big deal precisely because we have a hormone, for example, like insulin that works to regain homeostasis, right? Bring it back down to baseline. But it's the problem is when people are like chronically eating those kinds of things, chronically causing the blood sugar.
Exactly right, because then you burn out the reserve I'm using that term, it's not very scientific, but you can get the drift. We deplete the reserves from those hormone producing cells that are necessary to regulate for us automatically. And that, of course, if you think of a diabetic and what they learn about the regulation of blood sugar, they become masters of their blood sugar. They never knew when they had to manage themselves by measuring their blood sugar and then eating and taking insulin to dose it correctly, what a 24/7 job that is.
So CGM's really, I mean, because you're a medical doctor, must have been revolutionary to the treatment of, I mean, particularly people with type 1 diabetes, which is like a notoriously difficult condition to have.
Absolutely. And I think that as we start to recognize that metabolic syndrome can become type 2 diabetes, which then can later become a situation where a person has lost their insulin stimulating capability and now they become insulin dependent diabetics. Now we start seeing this epidemic, and you probably recognize, I wrote an article on this actually early on, I think it was published in Medium, with the SARS-CoV-2 infection. And I said, hey, this is a big problem, but this is a pandemic on a pandemic. We already have an underlying problem where our reserves that are necessary to modulate this additional stressor of this viral infection is in a compromised state. So you're going to have people that are depleted in their immune reserves who will be much more seriously affected because there's already a pandemic present that they're laying the second pandemic over. And of course, that was the case. Some people, when they got SARS-CoV-2, for them, it was fairly mild. Other people never survived.
Yeah, I remember when I had it. I mean, I've always been metabolically healthy, but even for me, it was rough. It was I had a fever for 7 straight days.
Yeah,
if not longer. It was crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about refined glucose yielding food products, right? Yeah. What else? What else should we be looking to avoid in order to promote optimal gut health?
Well, I think the other thing we've got to remember is that our microbiome, this complex array of microorganisms that live in our gut, several hundred different species that are all doing work for us, can be divided into 3 categories. Category 1 would be considered what are considered symbiotic. They do work for us. They produce vitamins. They produce trophic hormones. They're friendly. Second are commensals. Those are things that bugs that don't do a lot of good, but they don't do bad. They take up real estate and they kind of make a friendly place in our intestinal tract. And then the third are the ones that we're worried about. They're parasitic, and they produce noxious secondary substances that injure our body and have adverse effects on our immune system and create all these disorders downstream. Now, if you think of what the relative distribution of those 3 types of families of bacteria are in a healthy individual, they're overwhelmingly type 1 and type 2 with very small amounts of type 3. And in fact, in 1 gram of stool, just to give you a little factoid, there are more bacteria than there are stars in the known universe.
What?
Yes.
That's insane.
Now, of those, so that would be like 10 to the 11th, 10 to the 12th, that would be 1 with 12 zeros after it, bacteria in a gram of stool. Of those, about 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 8th are going to be friendly and commensals. So about 10 to the 4th, or 10,000, will be parasitic in a healthy person. So they're very held in check by all the others orders of magnitude. But in an unhealthy microbiome, that ratio changes. You start getting higher percentage of the toxiform family and less of the commensal and symbiotic family. And now you shift the balance towards adverse messages of alarm. And now your immune system knows it and speaks to the rest of your body. So what are the foods that feed the friendly bacteria? These are called prebiotics, aren't they? And those prebiotics are things that cause the friendly bacteria to produce things like short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, and butyrate that re-nourish the intestinal immune system and the gut mucosa and have a favorable impact upon immune vigilance, versus the toxic bacteria that have the adverse because they release things like lipopolysaccharides that produce endotoxemia, that doesn't sound good, and produce inflammation. So where do you find these prebiotics? You find them in vegetable products, minimally processed, fibrous foods, both insoluble and soluble fibers that then properly nourish your friendly bacteria. And there are all sorts of different types of prebiotics that have different effects on different families of bacteria. For instance, inulin, which is a very interesting story. It's found actually in the sugar beet, is a soluble fiber and it's also found in artichokes as well. There are many foods that have it. Inulin is a prebiotic that stimulates the production of butyrate, this very important short-chain fatty acid, and nourishes friendly bacteria to repattern your gut microbiome and improve your immune defense and resilience. Whereas if you ate something that was really devoid of fiber, let's say it was just processed starch, you're not going to get that favorable effect on your microbiome. And now you have the personalities of the toxic bacteria potentially starting to raise their heads and their voices more strongly.
Wow. So inulin is one of many types of prebiotic fiber that you find in.
We have fructans, we have arabinogalactans. One of the most interesting stories relates to mother's breast milk, because you might say, now hold on just a minute, breast milk doesn't have fiber in it. So what about this poor infant that's relying solely on its nutrition from mother's breast milk? How does its immune system, which is very naive when it's first born, how does it work? Well, it turns out that mother's breast milk has a prebiotic fiber in it, a prebiotic material. I necessarily wouldn't call it a fiber, that then it stimulates the developing microbiome of the infant and also the developing immune system of the infant, as well as something else that we're only now starting to discover. It's fascinating, because the fats in a woman's breast milk, if she's been eating a good diet with omega-3 oils in her diet, she will then produce in her breast milk high level of substances that are called pro-resolving mediators, or PRMs. Mother's breast milk from women who are eating a good, well-balanced diet that are rich in omega-3 oils will produce in her breast milk these PRMs. And what do? They stimulate the immune system of the infant to be in a stop inflammation stage. So that inflammation, like you see a lot of infants that have colicky situations, have a lot of digestive disorders, have atopy, well, that is a result of their immune system having problems. And maybe they're suffering from the lack of these immune checkpoint things that come from a mother's breast milk that is properly formed from her diet. It's been translated down into the infant.
Do you know if you could also get those in grass-fed bovine milk, cow milk?
Let's
why wouldn't
see.
you? I mean, I guess obviously they're different animals.
In colostrum, yes, because it's very high in colostrum. In cow's milk that has been milked every day, probably not in commercial milk to the extent that it is in colostrum-rich milk.
Because colostrum is like the first milk.
That's right.
So these resolving anti-inflammatory compounds are in human milk. You can buy bovine colostrum.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, it turns out that these pro-resolving mediators are also found in certain types of omega-3 fatty acid products in marine animals.
Wow.
So you find that there are certain fish oils where they have preserved PRMs. They have to be manufactured in such a way as not to lose them by chemical processing. A lot of the commercial omega-3 supplements unfortunately lose them, but the PRMs that come from minimally processed oils are equally able to then have positive effects on stopping these immune inflammatory issues.
Is that something you would see on the bottle of like a fish oil?
Yeah. In fact, this is a whole other part of the story for me. It's amazing where your life process can take you. So a number of years ago, I'll just summarize, I met a very interesting gentleman who owned a fishing company. I'm in Seattle, so there's a lot of fishing up there. And he was a marine architect, but he got very interested in fishing and designing fishing boats, and ultimately owns a fishing company. And it led us into deep discussions about these boats that he produces, which are quite interesting because he catches his fish, one fish at a time on a line and hook. It comes in, it's processed on board, and it's frozen to minus 10 degrees within 20 minutes from a live fish. And so I was talking to him, and he said, well, it's interesting because we have to throw away one part of the fish because we don't know what to do with it. And that's the fish guts. And I said, well, what's in the fish guts? And he said, what do you mean what's in it? I said, like, what are the biomolecules? He said, Jeff, I'm a fisherman. I'm not a chemist. I said, well, I'm a chemist. I'm not a fisherman. Why don't you send me some of those fish guts and let us put it through the lab and see what we can find? Well, it turned out when we did that, we found out that those fish guts that come from that processing that he uses were very high in these PRMs. So he and I then partnered together. We built a plant in Dutch Harbor, Alaska, in the Aleutian Islands, way out there in the chain. We got the state of Alaska to give us a grant to teach young men and women from Native Alaskans to become Chemtechs. We built a school and all sorts of things to house them. And now we're producing oil out of that factory that preserves these PRMs. So it's very, very interesting evolving story as it relates to how you use nature to your benefit by asking the right questions.
Damn, fish guts.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought?
Exactly.
Superfoods. Okay, so we want to focus on the prebiotic fibers, but like how much, because I feel like a lot of people, they hear about the value of inulin, for example, they go out, they'll buy an inulin supplement, they start taking it, then they experience profound gas, bloating,
exactly,
all kinds of bad stuff. So how could something be so good, make people feel so crappy sometimes?
Yeah. Well, remember, for most of us, if we travel, and I've done a fairly significant amount of travel in my life, over 3 million miles. So I've had a chance to taste lots of different cuisines and different time zones at different times.
Wow, that's awesome.
And so if you don't be careful, even eating really good foods in a new place can produce gastrointestinal problems. And we used to call that something like, I had food poisoning. Well, it really often wasn't food poisoning at all. It was you just changed the delivery of information to your digestive microbiome such that it was saying, oh, I've never seen this before. And you start to get different personalities of the microbiome producing different things that your immune system picks up, produces gut pain, cramping, diarrhea, all those things. And so the art is to do these things step at a time, right? No dramatic changes. You don't go from a low fiber 5 grams a day diet to 30 grams of fiber next day and expect that your gut is going to be really happy doing that. You have to have the transition. So for me, traveling, I'm always a little bit, the first few days kind of reminding my gut they're going to be experiencing some new information. And as a consequence, then to get ready and to be able to be resilient, which it takes about 48 hours generally for your gut microbiome to start gaining a new personality after you've changed your foods. So if you went from a carnivore diet to a vegetarian diet, you may find overnight, oh, gee, that didn't work out so well, and vice versa. You got to do it stepwise.
What are FODMAPs? I think a lot of people, when they get diagnosed with gut dysbiosis, SIBO, right? Like they get told to avoid FODMAPs. Is FODMAPs basically a catch-all term for all these types of prebiotic compounds?
Partly, but it stands for the fructose-related fructans, which are a form of the prebiotics, and the relationship they have with gut fermentation by specific bacteria within your microbiome. So the FODMAPs dietary approach eliminates these specific family of prebiotics that are related then ultimately to maybe too quick a change.
Interesting. Got it. So they're not necessarily, it's not all prebiotics. It's just like specific fructose related. Fascinating. What are your thoughts on digestive enzymes and the like? Do you have any thoughts on those? I feel like that's a big trend now. People are popping them with meals.
Well, that's another interesting topic. Back in the, I hate to say this, but back in the 80s, when I first started doing seminars for doctors about nutritional medicine, medical nutrition therapy, we talked about pancreatic insufficiency, chronic pancreatic insufficiency. And I had at that point, and this would have been the 80s, a number of gastroenterologists, well-esteemed from top medical centers, criticized me for bringing that up. Because they said, there really isn't such thing as chronic pancreatic insufficiency. You either have pancreatic disease, meaning exocrine pancreatic disease, where you're not secreting enzymes like cystic fibrosis, or you have normal function. There's nothing in between. And many of my colleagues said, no, that's not true. It's a gradation from optimal digestive enzyme secretion after eating versus no digestive enzymes. And so there may be people that are in between that require pancreatic enzyme replacement, pancreatin or some other form of pancreatic enzyme replacement. And we developed a whole treatment programs. We call it the 4R program, which the R stand for, this is basically a gastrointestinal restoration program. The 4R stand for remove the foreigners and the bad critters like food allergens and toxins. The next is replace, and that's replace digestive enzymes and stomach acid. The third R is reinoculate, that's pre and probiotics. And the fourth R is repair the gastrointestinal mucosa with things like zinc, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin E, and glutamine, and so forth. That 4R program is probably, if I was to be asked, what is the principal thing I'm proud of that I've developed over the last 40 years? It's probably that, because more docs are using that treatment now to manage hundreds of thousands of patients than anything I've done. And now, 2022, a lot of those criticisms that we had against pancreatic insufficiency have gone away. Now people are talking about it so much that you've probably seen advertisements from pharmaceutical companies that are now having a hotline. You call in if you have digestive problems, and they will tell you if you possibly have pancreatic insufficiency syndrome, not disease, pancreatic insufficiency syndrome. And then what is the treatment? Pancreatic enzymes.
Wow.
Just what we talked about in the 80s.
Wow. Yeah, you're prescient in your in your recommendations. I see them a lot here in Los Angeles, and I work with a company, and so I get them sent to me, and I have no they're like, my digestion has always been good, but I do find that when I take them sometimes, like with a heavy meal, with a meal that has, like, for example, a lot of fat, a lot of protein, a lot of, maybe indigestible, like cellulose, like plant material, that it does help things, like they do help things kind of like go down a little smoother. I mean, it's totally an anecdote, not, making claims.
Well, no, I think that's really an important observation. That's part of my travel rescue kit. I take pancreatic enzymes with me and betaine hydrochloride as a stomach acidifant because it kind of primes the pump when you have a changing dietary pattern. It gives you a little bit of rescue remedy.
Yeah. There's that saying, all disease starts in the gut, right? Wasn't that Hippocrates?
That's right. Yeah.
Would you go so far as to say that, like to like retweet that, or is that
I would retweet that.
Yeah.
Eli Metchnikoff, does that name anything to you?
No.
Okay, so Eli Metchnikoff, obviously by the name, was a Russian physiologist, won a Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology in 1901 for the discovery of the immune system, the innate immune system. And he did so when he was on the South Shore of France. He was down thinking about, because he took over as the director of the Pasteur Institute when Louis Pasteur died. And he was thinking about what bacteria do and how they're in the gut. And he picked up a starfish and a sea urchin. And he took the sea urchin with its quills, and he took those quills and he stuck them into the soft underbelly of the starfish. And he had a monocle, magnifying lens, and watched. And he saw these corpuscles come aggregate where the the sea urchin's quill went into the starfish. So he thought it was bacteria that were coming in there, but actually what it were immune cells that were coming. And then he started thinking, well, hold it. Are there immune cells in the intestinal tract? Is there something going on that connects the bacteria in the intestinal tract? Remember, this is the age of microbiology at the turn of the last century, and the immune system. And he then wrote a book called The Prolongation of Life. I'm very fortunate in my library. I have a first edition copy I'm very proud of, of that book. Now, what was the prolongation of life all about? It was Eli Metchnikoff talking about clinical experiences they had had by renourishing the gut microbiome by using enemas with lactobacillus bulgaricus, yogurt enemas, to reintroduce friendly bacteria. Now, I'm not saying that is the proper treatment any longer.
I'm sure some people listen to this and they're to their fridge.
So I'm not advocating that, but what I'm trying to say, this goes back, this concept that you're talking about, disease that Hippocrates talked about, disease starts in the gut, really was further advanced by Eli Metchnikoff, and now he's actually credited as being the one that kind of connected the immune system to the gut microbiome to all these hosts of immune-related diseases.
That is incredible. By the way, I'm not responsible for any of you guys hurting yourselves squirting yogurt up your butts. All right, but that's crazy. Yeah, because what we do is we have lactobacillus in our guts. Is that?
Yeah, it's one of the many hundreds of different types of bacteria that are in our microbiome.
And we also eat that when we consume yogurt. Wow, fascinating. This is so cool. Well, I feel like there's a lot more that we can cover, but you've given us some really salient, important, I think, widely applicable take-homes to embrace fermented foods, stressed plants, to avoid the refined grain products, to integrate prebiotic sources of fiber into your diet, but to do so slowly, and to manage blood sugar.
And don't forget polyphenols, these things that I talked about that are from ellagic acid that comes in berries, or quercetin, luteolin, hesperidin, rutin that comes from tartary buckwheat. These are all reprogramming our immune system through the function they have with our gut microbiome.
Love it. And so in so doing, people will then be able to get a handle on things like inflammation.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I've heard many people say inflammation causes all these chronic diseases. Inflammation is not the cause, it's the effect. The cause is upstream of that. It's the disturbed immune system. And that disturbed immune system can come as a consequence of poor gut hygiene. It can come from the exposure to toxic chemicals. It can come from glycemic response when you have fugitive glucose. So when we actually ask the question how we manage inflammation, we go upstream to answer that by regulating our diet and lifestyle.
It's so funny because people love to identify a boogeyman, especially the pharmaceutical industry, right?
Yeah.
It's just such a seductive notion, right? To identify a druggable boogeyman. But I think it's a really important exercise for people to ask, okay, so we have this thing that appears to be the cause, but what's the cause of that? Okay, that leads to this, right? Well, what's the cause of that?
That's right.
And to continue going down the chain, right?
So Max, you have just actually described precisely how functional medicine was born. That was the algorithm. That was the logic loop that led me into developing the concept of functional medicine. I had the fortune of having a 2-year sabbatical from my professorship back in the early 80s, 81 through 3, working with Dr. Linus Pauling, 2-time Nobel Prize winning laureate at his Institute of Science and Medicine at Stanford. And it was working with him that I was stimulated by extraordinary discussions that he shared with me to think about upstream systems, organizational networks, not downstream, how we uncouple messages and we treat symptoms. That was what actually led to the birthing of the concept of functional medicine.
That's so important. And now, you've obviously inspired so many of your colleagues in the space, people that are now, doctors, with medical professionals, healthcare professionals with large followings, lots of books out there, people that are familiar names that are familiar to, regular listeners of this show, people that I look up to a lot, David Perlmutter or Mark Hyman, all those guys. So yeah, very, very commendable work.
Well, let's look at one last connection here, which I know you're an expert in, but I would feel remiss if I didn't at least make this connection and segue. And that is the brain. So now we're the decade of the brain, or the era of the brain. And as you've said so brilliantly in many of your podcast discussions, the brain is not just segmented and removed from the rest of the body. It's not just a spinal tumor. It is an active communication with the body at large. And one of the things that we know is that the brain has its own immune system, and that's the microglia. Now, I feel very fortunate that I have been speaking about the microglia as the brain's immune system for 25 years. And at first it was like, really, is that true? And the reason that I started talking about it is that I have the fortune, because I'm kind of a sleuther of what's going on in basic science, that I started seeing this connection between immunologists and neurologists, in which the research was starting to point towards what we learned when I was in school, that the glial cells were the glue-like cells that actually glued together the neurons in the brain. So they had an architectural effect, but not a functional effect. They were more just like glue. Now, people started saying, no, hold it, it's more than just architecture. They also kind of participate in communication as the brain's immune system. And actually, they're derived from the same stem cells as are the macrophages and monocytes that are in our bloodstream, and the Kupffer cells in our liver, and the immune cells in our gut. So the gut is communicating with the brain. The brain is the second place that the immune system has communication, and the gut takes information from the brain. It's a cross current of discussion. So when we start talking about neuroinflammation that you're an expert in, we have to put that in the context of this whole story that we've been describing. How, as we've transitioned our foods and lifestyle and environment, we're sending signals to the brain's immune system through this complicated network of the immune, gut, and microbiome that ultimately leads to things like dementia and things like Alzheimer's disease, and even maybe neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's. So this is a story that is truly a web-like network story that we've segmented artificially into these different disciplines that we're trying to treat the downstream effects with drugs that really haven't worked.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think medicine has suffered for the reductionist approach that it has historically taken, right? Like you have neurologists that are looking for the solution to brain disease in the brain, right? But what if it came from down below? I mean, it's a possibility, like everything's connected, right? There was that fascinating study a couple of years ago about the patients that had a vagotomy procedure done, right? Where like those that had the vagus nerve severed had a stark risk reduction for the development of Parkinson's disease. It was something like 50%. Like how is that even like, possible, right?
Okay. Thank you. Let's talk about that just for a second. The vagus nerve, which is one of your spinal important nerves, is that which innervates the digestive system. And it's picking up information at the terminal trigeminal neurons that signal back to the brain and to the brain's immune system. So you're getting extraordinary information transfer through the vagus nerve to friends or foes that are present in your gut. And neuroinflammation, in fact, this last week's issue of probably the most highly regarded basic science journal in cellular biology called Cell were 3 back-to-back articles talking about how the gut mucosal environment with the microbiome speaks through the terminal neurons in the vagus nerve that are innervating the gut to produce these influences on brain function.
Fascinating. It's like it's the coolest thing.
It really is, because now it gives us a way, as you said, to go upstream and treat the cause, not just treat the effect.
Yeah. I just imagine where we're going to be. I can't imagine where we're going to be in 20 years from now.
I'm hopeful we're going to be in a much better place, saving people's function and improving their ability to do all the great things they can do in their lives.
I hope so, man, because I've seen dementia up close and personal, and it is not fun. It's awful. It's terrible. And so anything that we can do to get to the bottom of this mystery, like why are so many people getting demented? Why are so many people developing Parkinson's and Parkinson's-like conditions? And
so let's just take a deep breath, both of you and I, here for a moment. What we're talking about is the antidote to anxiety, fear, called hope. And I'd like to think right now we're crossing a threshold in which we're going to neutralize some of our anxiety as a culture by the hope that we can rejuvenate ourselves as human beings, emotionally, physically, physiologically. And talk is one of the appropriate ways to get people to reform their belief about themselves and how they can achieve that objective.
So talk, how does that unpack that a little bit? So being like social connection.
Yeah. So just think of this for a moment. What we're doing here is moving air. We're moving air, and that air that's moved as a wave is somehow being picked up by a neurosensory device, our hearing. It's translated into a neurological message. If we like what we're hearing from the compression of these waves of air, we have a whole body response. It can be everything from goosebumps to a sense of joy, or it can be the exact opposite. We've just moved air that is completely changing our body. Now, we want to move air in a way that sends messages to people of hope, resilience, and full expression of goodness. That's what we're doing.
That's what we're doing. Well, you do such a good job of that. So thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Well, don't want people to think we're talking about vegetables like celery oil or potato oil or, or tomato oil. Vegetable oil is the term that's used, but really we're talking about seed oils. Cottonseed, soybean oil, soybean seeds, et cetera.